So I'm going to be talking about grammar approaches and methodologies in the past. Hold on, I can't seem to move it on. Okay, is that moving? I hope it is.
Yes, yes, it is now. Again. Yes, Penny.
Thank you. Okay, I've got my chat box back. Yes, everything is fine. Okay, so I'm going to talk about grammar approaches and methodologies in the past to put things in context, and then move on to more recent approaches and methodologies, conclusions and hopes for the future. And I'm going to end up with, because I can't resist, a practical tip, as you said in my introduction. My main thing is really practical classroom teaching, and this is slightly different for me, the talk I'm giving today, talking about theoretical but also practical background to grammar teaching, but I can't resist doing a practical tip at the end. So here we go. So grammar approaches and methodologies in the past, and I'm going to look at it very much through my own experience, rather like Dave did, and our experiences actually are quite similar, and our conclusions are very similar as well. In fact, we have a very similar approach all over. When I first started learning another language, I learned it through grammar translation. Grammar translation says that language is a sort of framework of grammar with words inserted to make meaning. So if you teach the grammatical structures and the words, your students will learn the language. That sounds logical, with an emphasis on the written language and a lot of translation. So when I learned French, I did a lot of grammar exercises, a lot of reading, actually, because there's quite a lot of written language, and quite a lot of translation to and from French. So what happened when I went to France? First time I went to France, I thought, well, I know French. I learned it in school, so surely I should be able to manage. But no, surprise, surprise, I couldn't understand what people were saying to me. It was sort of a long stream of incomprehensible French speech. And it took me, 2 or 3 weeks before I managed to start making sense of what people were saying, and stopped asking them to slow down and speak word by word, and gradually got to understand and gradually became more fluent myself. And then later on, I actually began to be quite fluent in French. And when I became fluent, I then found that the grammar that I had learned through grammar translation in school actually came into its own and helped me express myself acceptably and fluently and accurately in French. So it's not all bad news, grammar translation. It shouldn't be thrown out completely. It has some advantages, and that the solid grounding of grammar stood me in good stead later. Then I came to this country and I started teaching. And I went into a period when the way to teach English was something called audiolingualism, very sort of behaviorist. Language is a set of habits, says audiolingualism. So what you need to do is give students lots of stimuli and with automatic responses, so they automatically accumulate a sort of feel for the grammar. So lots and lots of mimicry, learning by heart, drills, repetition. The teacher says, I go to school. He, and the school students say, he goes to school. They go to school, and so on. What's called substitution drills. And these were very, very popular at the time when I started teaching. We were told to teach like this. A lot of emphasis on the spoken language, and this it differed from grammar translation. And but still, what it had in common with grammar translation was an emphasis on getting it right. The basis being grammar and getting the grammar right. I remember when an inspector came to visit me once, and we discussed it, and she said to me, so I was teaching vocabulary, she said, don't bother teaching them vocabulary. She said, they'll pick it up. The main thing is to get the grammar right. And she was so wrong, actually. You do need to teach vocabulary, and if I had to choose between which is more important, grammar or vocabulary, vocabulary is more important, as Dave said earlier. It's vocabulary which gets your meanings across. And also, of course, no L1. Then I started teaching using audiolingual. This is me in my first class. You can see from my body language how nervous I was. Late 1960s, early 1970s. And all the textbooks were based on these drills and dialogues, and it was a bit boring. Very little attention to vocabulary and no use of L1, although I did use a bit of L1 and I still do, and that's a topic for another talk. But basically I got a bit bored with it. And towards the end of the 1970s, wow, the communicative approach and the idea that language is not a set of habits, and language is not a set of grammatical structures, and language is not a list of words. Language is communication, or language is for communication. And Henry Widdowson's seminal book, Teaching Languages, Communication, came out in 1978, and it was a revolution for most of us who were teaching at that time. So instead of teaching forms, we now taught learners meanings in another language, to understand and make meanings, and grammar suddenly became much, much less important. So the classroom became much more fun, much more exciting, because you were saying meaningful things and exchanging ideas. The implementation, however, was sometimes difficult for teachers and materials writers, and the testing was a real problem, because if you're not going to test for correct forms, but test for success in communication, the criteria for passing and failing become very, very difficult, and this really posed a lot of problems for designers of tests and indeed for materials writers. So I became more and more experienced, and I started writing myself. And my first book, because I was so excited about the communicative approach, my first book was something called Discussions That Work. And it was really based on the communicative approach, based on getting students to talk. Because one of my first problems as a teacher, and I expect that most of you have had the similar experience, was that I couldn't get them to speak in English. They kept lapsing into mother tongue or not speaking at all. And I worked out some ideas of how to get students to speak and to speak to each other. And I eventually published it as a book. And then I went on to write another one, also based on the communicative approach, called Teaching Listening Comprehension, but also basically communicative listening and understanding. But then my third book was Grammar Practice Activities. Now, Grammar Practice Activities is perhaps my favorite of all my own books, and the one I use most. And I was back to grammar because I couldn't really agree with the idea that grammar should be abandoned. I think grammar is really important. But we can do grammar communicatively. How does it fit into the communicative approach? By making grammar activities rather like the ones that Dave was describing to you earlier, and which also formed the basis for my book, Grammar Practice Activities. So let's move on in my career. My next station in life perhaps was being myself a methodologist and a writer, and starting to read background literature on English teaching methodology and looking at the more theoretical approaches and methodologies. And what came up very, 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 very soon after the entry of communicative language teaching was something called TBLT, task-based language teaching, which is a methodology which says the main thing is communication. The syllabus is communicative. It's not grammar, it's not vocabulary, it's communicative tasks. There should be no grammatical syllabus. A lot of collaborative work on communicative tasks, learning essentially from exposure and interaction rather than from the teacher telling you what to do, and an emphasis on student autonomy. the teacher as facilitator rather than teller. So the question comes up, where does grammar come in? Are we just going to let students pick up the grammar through plenty of comprehensible input within the communicative classroom? And Steve Krashen would say yes. But a lot of people don't agree with him. And there has, in fact, been quite a lot of recent research that just picking up grammar through communication doesn't always work so well. There's negative evidence, there's positive. Negative evidence that if you don't have explicit teaching, you don't learn very well, and positive evidence that if you do have explicit teaching, it helps. Let's start with the negative evidence. There's quite a lot of research on people who learned English as a second language without instruction, only through interaction, through exposure, through being immersed in the target language environment. Study WES, the WES study by Schmidt. This was a Japanese guy who went to live in the States and picked up English through interaction, became extremely fluent and extremely effective as a communicator, but remained with a very, very noticeable grammatical mistakes in his speech. Another study done by Swain and her colleagues in Canada looked at English-speaking children put into a French-speaking school and learning French through being in this school, through being exposed all during the school day only to French. And what Swain found was that they got to 12th grade very, very fluent in French, but still making mistakes in, for example, gender that a native speaker of French would never make. And she came to the conclusion that you need some explicit teaching of grammar in order to eradicate these mistakes, or the students never become aware of them. To move on to the positive evidence, learners who have some explicit grammar teaching within an instructional situation tend to learn the grammar better than if they don't, even if they're learning within an overall communicative framework. If they have some explicit input, explanations, focused practice, and error correction, they tend to come out speaking a more grammatical English. And the two studies here I have up on your screen. I'm not giving the full references here. These are at the end of my presentation. There's actually a list of the full citations if you want them, and you'll get them in your goodie bag later, but I won't display them for the moment. So within the communicative framework, within task-based language teaching, people became aware that, yes, you do need some explicit focus on grammatical form within communicative language teaching. How are we going to do it? And the main channel which came up and has been discussed a lot in literature is something called focus on form, integrating some explicit grammar work into a predominantly communicative process. And what it means is that if you, while you're doing your communicative task, you come up against, or you notice for some reason, a grammatical point within the communication, and you take a few minutes time out to explain, to talk about, to draw students' attention to the grammatical point in question. And then you go back into your communicative task, but the communication remains the main focus of the lesson. Now, this kind of it's called reactive focus on form, is contrasted rather confusingly with something called proactive focus on forms with an S, which means the conventional presenting grammar without any reference to any communicative task, but presenting it, you can present it in context, as Dave was saying before, but it's not actually within a communicative task. It is proactive. I'm now going to talk about the present continuous. I'm now going to talk about comparative adjectives. Let's learn about it, and then let's go back into our communicative or other kinds of activities. So back to focus on form. Focus on form, the idea that you just take temporary time out from a communicative activity, means temporarily focusing on the grammatical form. And you might want to focus on it for various reasons, very often because of a learner error, or because a learner asks a question about something that's come up, or a salient or repeated grammatical feature in a text, which either teacher or students notice and want to focus on. Focus on forms. Remember, this was the traditional proactive, we're going to have a grammar lesson or half a grammar lesson, proactive teaching of grammatical features based on usually a grammatical syllabus, which is systematically covered, often identified with what's called PPP, a presentation, practice, production. And the question is, which is better? Which is better, to focus on forms, the traditional explain, practice, and then use it in your own output, or just incidentally and reactively focusing on grammatical structures as they come up in communicative tasks without a grammatical syllabus? Well, there isn't really any answer to this, or the answer would be neither or both. The research where asked students and teachers which they thought was better, which they found was better, you get very, very mixed results. And the obvious conclusion is there's probably a place for both. And I'll come back to this in my conclusions later. I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about practice, the place of practice. This has also been controversial in the literature. Some people say we should practice, and some people say we shouldn't. Should we be doing practice exercises, drills? Some people say they don't help very much because Krashen says that it's enough to have comprehensible input. Ellis has another reason, and if you'd like to see Ellis's position, I've got his article in the bibliography at the end of the presentation. But anyway, there's quite a strong school of thought which says practice is a waste of time, basically. And other people who say that's not true. Practice does help. Grammar practice exercises do help substantially. Here's one piece of research which indicates that they do. And of course, there's swings of pendulums here. Last decade, the last century, or the first decade of this, you got a fairly strong trend. If you look at the articles in the periodicals and the books, fairly strong trend against PPP, against traditional teaching, explaining, and practicing of grammar, and in favor of task-based communicative work with occasional reactive focus on form. However, in the last 10, 15 years, there's been evidence that there's a swing back. More and more people are saying, well, yes, perhaps there is a place for traditional grammar teaching, and I'll say how I think this fits in a moment. I think that a really nice summary by Criado 2013, she says, what seems to be an eclectic and fair approach towards PPP is to regard it as one out of the many pedagogical techniques that teachers can draw on in their teaching kits to teach language. And I think that's a really fair and acceptable conclusion. So, my conclusions and hopes for the future. I said what I thought would be the future. I think the future is mix and match, but not mix and match because I feel like doing this today or feel like doing this tomorrow. Not what's called an eclectic approach, but a principled approach. Principled means based on principles. What are my principles? My principles for choosing which way to teach grammar would be based on primarily, this is the main thing I look at all the time when I'm writing and I'm thinking about teaching. What leads to effective learning? What gets my students to learn well? And I'll judge effective learning partly through research insights, though I will try to be informed by and not dictated to by research. Research is often contradictory anyway, but even where there is a majority opinion, I will still treat it as information rather than this is what I ought to do. Plus, very importantly, my own classroom experience, your own classroom experience, what works for you in a particular context, and modifications of specific context. Because what may fit me in one context of teaching may not fit in another context. What works in one country may not work in another country. What works with one age group may not work in another age group, and so on. The context is amazingly important. It makes a huge difference. I would look now at some applications and conclusions. As far as task-based language teaching is concerned, the research literature to this day is on the whole in favor. And my experience is that when I'm teaching academic classes, I use it predominantly. It's the main methodology. School teaching, I'm not so sure. Adolescents and children, I'll do a mixture, perhaps what Ellis calls task-supported rather than task-based language teaching, with lots of communicative components, but also a lot of traditional explanation and practice. And the context makes a big difference, whatever the local culture of learning. Some countries or areas or communities find task-based language teaching really congenial and helpful, and others find it really difficult. So that's another thing to take into account. And a fourth thing to take into account is pedagogical factors. Not most of the literature is about language acquisition, but what interests us more than whether something is language acquisition friendly or not is pedagogical factors like, for example, does group work in my class? Or do I have discipline problems which makes it difficult for me to organize group work? Or what exam have I got coming up that I need to take into account? Or what do the parents of my teenage or young parents, what do they expect, and will that influence the way I teach? There are all sorts of factors other than pure language acquisition which I need to take into account. So my conclusion would be, yes, a task-based component, but not task-based language teaching alone. As regards the focus on forms issue, research allows for both, indeed encourages both. In my experience, my language teaching, my grammar teaching is mainly traditional focus on forms, but enriched by occasional reactive focus on form. Materials on the whole, as in the example of the book that Dave was looking at, Gateway, a proactive grammatical syllabus, is there in most textbooks you look at today. And the bottom line is that good grammar teaching requires both. It is not enough just to present and practice. You also need, when you're in the middle of a cognitive activity, every now and again to take time out to draw students' attention to how the grammar is working in a particular context. So both. And my last topic is practice exercises. Research indicates that practice exercises contribute to learning. It helps, but the saying practice makes perfect is misleading. It doesn't make perfect. It helps. And there's a big difference between the two. There's a problem of transference. We all know that the experience of a student who gets everything right in a in a practice exercise, full marks, ticks all down the line, and then the next day comes up with a mistake in exactly the same grammatical structure that he or she got right in the exercise. So it doesn't always transfer. In order for practice to transfer, it needs to be as communicative, as meaningful as possible. And so we need to think about this when we're designing practice exercises. And then there's the aspect of interest and motivation. So my bottom line is what we need are interesting, meaningful grammar practice activities, which brings me right back to what Dave was talking about in his talk earlier, and all his ideas were exactly this: interesting, meaningful grammar practice activities. And I'm coming on now to my final PS, the last 5 minutes of my talk. I just want to talk about a practical tip: adapting textbook grammar exercises. Dave was talking about some really interesting and productive grammar activities. And what I want to add to that is what we can do with conventional grammar exercises that look as if they're not very communicative and not very meaningful, how we can play with them and adapt them to make them more interesting, meaningful, and indeed heterogeneous. So let's have a look at this, for example. She early, and it's to practice irregular past tenses forms. She said the student has to say she left early, he made the cake, and so on and so on and so on. Now, as it stands, that is not communicative, it's not particularly interesting, not particularly meaningful. You could actually do it correctly without understanding most of the sentence. You just take the word and put it into the past. How do I make it more meaningful? Well, one suggestion is to ask students to ignore the end of the sentence and only look at the past tense of the verb and finish it any way they like. So the exercise becomes like this. And I deliberately left off the numbers here. Choose any you like, and what sentence could you make? What sentence could you make from any of those, adding whatever end you like? Nutter says almost all textbooks provide meaningful practice. So yes, but they also provide things like the one I just showed you, which are not meaningful. And I'll show you another one in a minute. Okay. Any ideas how to end any of these sentences here? So we had, I sat there bored stiff until the end of the lecture. I hope you're not talking about my lecture. She left him, she left quickly. I sat there, he made her cry. Yes, there's all sorts of things. And what you can find when you do this in the classroom, look at these lovely ideas coming up in the chat box. I won't read them all. But what you do in class, you get something very similar to what is happening here. You get all sorts of original, interesting sentences that are communicative, that are meaningful, interesting, very often humorous. And I don't know if you noticed this, but sometimes you get very simple sentences, sometimes very advanced ones. So it caters, this kind of challenge caters for all sorts of different levels of students. It's really important. Let's look now at something from Gateway to the World, just to come full circle and back to the book that Dave was talking about earlier. And this is actually an extract from one of his slides. One of the exercises in the book were like this. Now, yes, it's true that a lot of grammar exercises in books are communicative. This is clearly not. This is purely aimed at getting the sentence right. In this case, it's adverbs of frequency and tenses. What is the appropriate tense, present progressive or present simple, with a with an adverb of frequency. And it's mostly obviously the present simple, but the number 2, I think you can say, you're always interrupting me, and it's perfectly correct. So I do it the first time with my students normally, conventionally, as the textbook expects me to. So we'll do it like this, and we'll come up with correct sentences like this. Okay, we've done this, but then that's not enough. I want to make it interesting. I want to make it meaningful. I want to make it more heterogeneous. And what I will do is this. I will delete the end of the sentence, and I will invite students to finish the sentence any way they like. So over to you again. Give me some examples for any of these. How might you finish these? Okay, I don't usually do sports. Yes, exactly that sort of thing. I don't usually hug people. Yeah, okay. Mia always studies maths. I don't usually, he was going too fast from that. Adam is always changing his mind. Okay, so all sorts of things you can do is, and again, you've got added value in the sense of what I said, that one of my goals, or the main goal, is effective learning. You're getting much, much more practice in present simple, present progressive, and the placing of the frequency adverbs. So much, much more practice, much more interesting, humorous, fun, and the possibility of the students contributing at different levels. Okay, that's it. And thank you very much for your attention. If anybody would like to write with any questions or comments, please feel free. Here's my email for you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Penny. So it was a lovely talk. We've got a few questions. Yes. One of the participants had a very interesting comment. Good results depend on how well the teacher teaches using his or her approach, the chosen approach. What do you think?
Absolutely, I agree. I don't think there's any such thing as the best methodology. There's whatever the best methodology is for me. And teachers, if a teacher believes in what they're doing and believes in the students and is focused on bringing about learning and motivation for those students, it really doesn't matter what methodology you use or what you prioritize. It's up to you. And I said before, it also depends on the context. Thank you for that. That's
great. Thank you. Lots of questions. Another one. Do you think that practice is where you get the real understanding?
Sorry, practice where you get what?
Is where you get real understanding?
Yes, if the practice is well designed. If it is just only getting the word right, getting the structure right, like in the first exercise I showed you, you could actually do it without understanding anything, just by taking the present tense and putting it into the past. If the exercise is designed so that you have to understand in order to do it, then yes, it leads to understanding.
A lot of people talked about technology, and we know that we use technology for communication, but we also know that technology and the use of technology, or the overuse of technology, is affecting communication. What do you think about the use of technology in the classroom?
Technology in the classroom is like any other tool. It's a tool, like pencils and papers and whiteboards and blackboards. It's a tool, and therefore how effective it is depends on how effectively you use it. There are some cases where the technology can contribute an enormous amount, and there are some places where it actually gets in the way. So it's a question of thoughtful use of the technology to bring about optimum learning and motivation.
Yeah, again, depending on objectives, depending on context, and so many variables.
So many variables, you're absolutely right, yes, yes.
Well, Penny, it's been a great pleasure. We all adore you. It's a great honor to have you here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed.